Coming up on Dr. Kiki's Science Hour, we're talking about Climategate, longevity, and mile-high blood with John Rennie. That's up next on Dr. Kiki's Science Hour.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit. Bandwidth for Dr. Kiki's Science Hour is provided by Cachefly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Dr. Kiki's Science Hour with Dr. Kiki, episode 54, recorded Thursday, July 8th, 2010. All the science news that's fit to. This episode of Dr. Kiki's Science Hour is brought to you by GoToAssist Express. Providing tech support to clients and colleagues in person is expensive and time-consuming. Support smarter remotely with GoToAssist Express. For a free 30-day trial, visit gotoassist.com/Kiki. Audible.com. For your free audiobook download, please visit audiblepodcast.com/Kiki. Welcome, everyone, to Dr. Kiki's Science Hour. I'm Dr. Kiki, and this is the Science Hour, the hour where we get to talk about nothing but science. Well, today we're going to be talking about science writing. We're going to be talking about the good and the bad of science writing, the controversies, the biases. Wait, what? Controversy and bias in science? That doesn't sound right. Well, in science writing, it's not necessarily as cut and dried as science types would like it to be. So to join us today to talk about this wonderful topic and to kind of weave the topic into a few stories that have hit the presses recently, I'm going to be speaking with John Rennie. John Rennie is, welcome.
Hello. Hello, Dr. Kiki.
It's wonderful to have you here today. John Rennie is a science writer. He is an editor. He is a lecturer. He is contributing editor and former editor of Scientific American. And he is currently also adjunct professor of journalism at New York University. So you've been around this science writing field for years. Mm-hmm. What have you seen in the years? I mean, you spent a bulk of your career at Scientific American working as the editor there. What have you seen over the years in terms of changes in priorities or attitudes about writing science?
Well, I think as far as writing science goes, I would say that within sort of the journalistic community, you're seeing much the same attitude that really has always been there. That is that the journalists who tend to specialize in science and technology writing, which can be sort of a rare breed, are always highly enthusiastic about it. They love to do it because they're interested in the science and they love explaining it to people. I think that there have been some interesting changes, for example, within the scientific community. There used to be a very strong stigma attached to a lot of scientists who are seen as, in fact, slumming if they spoke to the public directly. I think that over the past couple of decades, maybe for budgetary reasons, maybe because of the big successes of books like Stephen Hawking's books and the like, you've seen some change in that. There are maybe more scientists who are happy to go right out and address the public directly and to speak to science journalists directly. Although there is still quite a bit of concern about that, and frankly, very understandably so. The more sweeping social change, I think, is that the institution of science itself, which used to be seen and accepted maybe a little too naively as a sort of objective institution, as something that that everyone could trust, that faith in the public's mind has been very steadily eroded. I think as a result of probably, in some respects, a sort of campaign by various sorts of interests who have seen the scientists and the scientific community as being allied against them, and who felt that in some ways it was important to try to knock the scientists down a peg in the public eye.
Yeah, and in relation to that, there was a quote I think I read on Andrew Revkin's blog in the New York Times today from Mike, forgetting his name, Michaels is believe his last name, who's a climate science skeptic. And
Patrick Michaels, he's with
Michaels.
the Cato Institute, yes.
Okay, thanks. And he actually said that he thinks it's good that people don't trust scientists.
Yeah, it's a very funny quote because Andy asks him the question: do you see it as a good thing that public confidence in the entire field of climate research should be eroded by some of these attacks by some of the skeptics and the like? And Michaels begins by saying no, and then he goes on for the equivalent of a couple of paragraphs detailing all of what is just what's wrong with the scientific community and why it is that they can't be trusted. I had suggested on a blog item that it would actually be in the future a lot more efficient for him to just say yes, because it's clearly exactly what he wants. He wants to erode faith in climate research. And I mean, quite frankly, you could sort of interpret some of that as just a desire to erode faith in science altogether.
Yeah, and eroding faith in science, I mean, what ultimate gain is there? I mean, and is this a battlefield? I mean, should we think of it in that way?
The problem is that if science and technology were just sort of neatly boxed off in some little area where it's like, look, we're figuring out how the universe works, everyone, and if it could all just be sequestered off in sort of the fun little style section of newspapers, in effect, if it could just live in little supplements, detached from the rest of society and from policies, I don't think there would be this attack. The problem is that increasingly, in some ways, we live in a world where the technology is more ubiquitous, and the effects of the technology are ubiquitous. And the footprint that human beings leave on the environment of the planet is bigger and more pervasive all the time. And so as a result of that, the science illuminates a lot of this, to the extent that some of those answers are going to discomfit people who are very well positioned within the status quo. They have a reason to try to fight back against that in exactly the same way that, say, the tobacco companies tried to, for decades, to try to do everything possible to convince the public that there was absolutely nothing to the gigantic amount of data that was accumulating showing that tobacco caused cancer and that it was bad for you. Eventually, they sort of threw in the towel on that disinformation campaign. I think we're seeing something similar with in some respects, with what's gone on with some of the resistance to the move for climate policy reform. Yeah. And even in some cases with some evolution creationism issues. And it's easy to say that not just because you're looking at some of the same tactics, but in some cases you're looking at some of the exact same people saying very, very similar things. They've just done the equivalent of scratching out tobacco and putting in anthropogenic climate change instead.
And where do you come from in all of this? We were talking about how science is so integrated into our daily lives and the politics and the policy that's happening around us at this point in time. Where do you fall in terms of where you come from and in your perspective? I would, like most people who get asked that question, we all start off wanting to say that we take some sort of fairly centrist position. But what does that mean in practice? Sure, I may be a moderate in a lot of ways. Listen, I believe in the science. Even using the word believe is wrong. I accept the value of what science establishes using
empirical evidence accumulation and logic and the rest. I accept that science illuminates in a very credible, reliable way the state of reality. I would like to think that a lot of my political views, which I think I'm probably a fairly unashamed liberal in all sorts of ways, but I would think that a lot of my views on that are at least informed by my understanding of what the science says, and in some cases the limitations of what the science says.
In terms of the words, it seems like that's becoming the real the playing field. Is the use of specific words? So you use the word believe. And in the chat room, people are having a conversation about faith in science, belief in science. Right. To change the word from believe to accept, I mean, it's a slight difference, but it means so much. You know, it's one word difference, but it actually is very significant in the scheme of what you really mean and what you're trying to explain as far as your viewpoint is.
Right. Everything that we understand through science is understood to be true provisionally. That is, it's built up on some sort of underlying structure of facts and experiments and assumptions and things that are well supported. Listen, think of things that we look at as rock solid, things like, our understanding of atoms, our understanding of how stars work, things that we have a lot of understanding of at this point. All of these things, in theory, within the rules of the game of science, could be knocked out at any time. If somebody came up with the right sort of experiments and said, turns out the Earth actually is balanced on the back of a gigantic turtle that is itself on the back of an even bigger turtle. Right. If the evidence is there, the evidence is there. It ain't there in that particular case. But right, everything is there. Whereas with belief and in issues of faith, I think that really does ultimately come down to, in some respects, when you say that you have faith in something, in a lot of cases, it means that you are willing to accept it as true, even in the absence of any sort of supporting evidence, and maybe even in the face of conflicting evidence. I think that can be a way that people can choose to live their lives, and I have a lot of respect for what that can mean and the value of what that can mean for a lot of people on issues that with respect to religion and the like. But when you're coming back to issues that the science itself directly bears on, I think that from a public policy standpoint, we're a lot better guided by the science than we are by people's less supported beliefs.
And it turns out that science is showing us more and more often that our minds are easily tricked, and our the way that we see the world, and what we think are patterns aren't necessarily real patterns, but just things that our minds have picked out. So there is a psychological barrier here as well that we need to be thinking about in terms of science writing and trying to put science in parallel with science writing. Science and science writing both want to report the facts. Science is maybe dealing in data. Science writing is telling the story. But at the same time, the facts are trying to be reported. But there's a schism there somewhere. There's not always a happy flow from what the scientist does and what they discover in the laboratory and write in a journal article or say at a meeting to what the science writer ends up writing in the story and how the science ends up being delivered to the public. What happens there?
I think that sort of disjunction pops up for a lot of different reasons. Some of them, first of all, there's probably not a science writer alive who doesn't have the experience of having been working on a story and thought, man, this would be the best story possible if this little thing weren't so. That this one little detail ruins everything. But if you're a good science journalist, well, you have to accept the fact that now you can't go with the story you would like to be able to tell. You have to go with the one that is actually true. The difficulties, obviously, to the extent that science journalists are serving as intermediaries between the highly detailed, highly technical information that the scientists have, and which may, again, any of their findings are understood in this provisional framework. And that they then have to be able to speak to the general public, which is naive of a lot of that information. They're genuinely not informed about a lot of it. They genuinely probably don't care about a lot of it, but they do want to get some information out of that. Maybe they want inspiration, maybe they want entertainment, maybe they want genuine education along the way. It's very, very difficult to take the fire hose of what may be in the scientific journals itself and be able to stage that down to a nice palatable trickle that a lot of people in the general public can take without, in some cases, introducing some level of unfortunate distortion. Really good journalists do everything in their possible in their power to avoid that, and in some cases you really can get very, very close to it. But the reality is that you are almost always simplifying a lot when you are talking to the public, and you're leaving out a lot of details, and that is something that can create conflicts between the scientists and the journalists, and then also the public too. So it's just inevitable that you're going to have some of those kinds of conflicts. But for the most part, what's very nice about working in science journalism is that you're mostly surrounded by a lot of people who are really making good faith efforts to do it right.
And where are we right now? I mean, I find myself, I hang out a lot online. There is this vibrant community of science bloggers. On Twitter, I just have the fire hose of information coming at me all the time. I feel like there is amazing science journalism happening everywhere. But that's because I'm really plugged in. I mean, is it because I'm just really plugged in? I hear these stories. I hear, newspapers folding their science department. CNN got rid of their science department. What is really happening in terms of the national and even the world, global scale of science journalism? Where are we?
Yeah, last year there was a World Conference of Science Journalists in London. I had the pleasure of speaking at that, and I at one point I was giving a talk, and I said, let's be very clear about this. This is actually a terrific time for science journalism for all the reasons that you pointed out. There is more science journalism, and there are more opportunities if you are a science journalist to put your information and your stories and your views out there than there ever have been in the past. It's unfortunately also a kind of bad time for science journalists if you're looking to be a professional person doing that, in terms of being able to make a living and a comfortable living doing that. But that's not a problem that's unique to science journalism. That's a problem to this gigantic media transformation we're seeing of all different kinds, and it's why it takes down entire newspapers, and why it affects magazines, and why it affects television, and everyone is still trying to sort out what make for good new kinds of business models and all of that, since those business models will ultimately determine how many people like me get to keep our phony baloney jobs. But that's sort of the transition that we're in, and ultimately the best solutions on all of that are they're probably not going to arise in any distinctive way out of some brilliant thing that science journalism itself comes up with, though there's a room for a lot of great innovation within science journalism, I think. But some of these things will eventually stabilize. But for the person who's just a consumer of this at home, it's never been easier to find really great, first-rate, well-informed science journalism and science writing and reporting in many ways of a kind that never existed in the past. The opportunities for mistakes to be caught and corrected and to have a kind of dynamic, active interchange with the actual scientists themselves. That's something that just wasn't there not so long ago.
And I'm going to take this opportunity to take a quick break for a word from our sponsor, and we will be continuing this conversation after this short break to delve into some of these issues that have been brought up in the first part of the show. So, Without any further ado, thanks to our sponsor, Go to Assist Express. Go to Assist Express provides tech support for you. If you provide tech support, you know that going to a person's home or office, it's time consuming and kind of expensive, right? So the easy, cost-effective way to support them is with Go to Assist Express. You can fix the problem without being there in person. You can view another computer online and control it, so you can resolve technical issues quickly. Whether you are in customer support, technical consulting, or management, or just a computer guru, Go to Assist Express. It helps you to increase revenue, reduce travel and support time, service more clients, and make the most out of your workday. And they're giving you this special offer. If you try Go to Assist Express free for 30 days, you can visit gotoassist.com/Kiki, and you get free for 30 days the ability to give customer support, to control other users' computers, to be able to fix them from your computer. So if you're, one end of the Bay Area, you don't want to drive to the other end of the Bay Area, or if you're up in the Poconos and you don't want to go down to the bottom of New York, whatever you're doing, you don't have to, because you just need an internet connection and Go to Assist Express, and you can try it out for these 30 days. So how it works: you start your sessions with one click, just like all the services from Citrix. One click, it's easy. You can send the person you are helping an instant email invitation. This works on both PCs and Macs, so it deals with that cross-platform issue that can be kind of sticky. Next, you share your screen, and they can share theirs, so you can see the same problem they are seeing. It's two-way screen sharing. It's kind of cool. It includes an integrated live chat, so you can also have a conversation online if you'd like. So if you can't hold the phone on your ear, or you got the speakerphone across the room, whatever, you can actually chat and do your helping at the same time. Next, you diagnose the problem as you access their desktop remotely. Go to Assist tells you what software is running on their machine, operating system, programs running, security software, etc., and then fix the problem by accessing their files on their computer or transferring files from your computer to theirs. You'll solve more tech support questions more quickly and help clients even when they are away from their computer. Go to Assist is brought to you by Citrix, and all data exchanged during your sessions is completely secure with end-to-end 128-bit encryption. There's free customer service. It's available 24/7. And once again, 30 days for free if you simply go to gotoassist.com/Kiki. And we will get back to our conversation now. We're speaking with John Rennie, former editor of Scientific American and current contributing editor and science writer. We're talking about science writing and the culture that is kind of being built around it, whether or not you are a writer or a consumer of this, and how the entire culture is affecting the science writing that we're actually seeing. So, John, there was a really interesting story this last week. Speaking of, the biases that might be inherent in science writing. Some people in our chat room brought up the idea that, corporate intervention, blah, 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 corporations and research, it's making science less trustworthy. Now, Science Blogs is an online blog service. What happened this last week that has got a bunch of people at Science Blogs up in arms?
Yeah, as you pointed out, I mean, the Science Blog site is one of the most vigorous, best well-known networks of science bloggers that you'd find any place on the web. A lot of the top names in the field are there or have been there at different times, and they have a lot of different blogs. In the past, there have sometimes been some blogs that have had a corporate sponsorship there. That is that, for example, General Electric, they provided money that basically that helped to subsidize the creation of one particular blog that was on a number of different topics. But the thing that raised the ire of a lot of the science bloggers just this past week was when they suddenly discovered that a new blog called Food Frontiers was being introduced, and that was being supported by PepsiCo. Now, PepsiCo, of course, is well known for Pepsi and a lot of other sorts of junk foods, and now they were
and
the ones
unfortunately not sponsoring us. No.
Well, surely. Well, they may have an opening now, as we'll mention in a second. They were now sponsoring this food that was supposed to be about nutrition and food science, and the idea was that that scientists who worked for PepsiCo would be writing a lot about sort of the frontiers of food technology and where this was going. Obviously, this serves a PR purpose for PepsiCo, and there had been other corporate blogs that were there in the past, but in some respects, the authorship of this one and the kind of what struck a lot of people as the jarring, ironic inappropriateness of what was seen as a maker of junk foods being behind a blog that was supposed to be about nutrition really bothered a lot of the bloggers there. They saw it as something that reflected badly on the integrity of science blogs as a whole and on them. And as a result, a number of the bloggers decided that they had had enough and they've resigned from science blogs. Most of them stayed. Some of them were willing to take an attitude of, well, let's wait and see what happens. But basically, it caused a lot of trouble. And at first, it looked like somewhat, after the horse had escaped the barn, the management of science blogs was going to try to make some changes that would accommodate the sensibilities about this. But in fact, earlier today, they basically threw in the towel and removed the Food Frontiers blog, and have sort of apologized about that whole dust-up. It shows how I think in sort of the new digital media, it's particularly easy in some ways to make some sorts of mistakes, although it is also true that a lot of this issue of corporate sponsorship of something that could be mistaken for independent editorial, that's an area that traditional print publishers have dealt with a lot in the past, and in retrospect, at least, it's kind of unfortunate they didn't do more to take a leaf from what print magazine publishers or newspaper publishers might have done about this, and actually even also broadcasters too, who also have relevant rules.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. Is why obviously there are going to be some new areas that have not been dealt with by print, like the fact that pages that are indexed by Google are not treated differently. So corporate sponsored pages versus independent blogs, actual researcher blogs, they're not going to be treated differently or look any different in the Google search engine, but the actual content, I mean, that stuff has been dealt with, like you said, for years. I mean, there are manuals or handbooks, guidelines on how to deal with this stuff.
And there are guidelines and manuals specifically for digital media too. So in some ways, it's not just as though science blogs acted rather obliviously of what print might have done in that situation. They acted obliviously to what a lot of other websites would have done in that situation. There are ways about trying to create more of those distance, even to dealing with some of the issues of trying to make sure that, say, Google News is not going to mistake your advertorial for other editorial content. But they didn't do all of that, or they didn't do any of it until a little bit too late. And it shows how rapidly things can really blow up.
And I'm just wondering, is there a precedent for this with anybody else? I mean, I'm sure there has to be, but is science blogs trying to forge some new direction of advertising integration into their blog structure, or is there any other precedent anywhere?
I don't have any sort of great ideas about a specific precedent. I mean, the kind of issues, the sort of proposals that it sounds like, say, PepsiCo came to science blogs with. A lot of publishers, whether they're traditionally print publishers or just entirely new media publishers, I mean, they get those kinds of proposals a lot. I think in most cases they would get everybody involved would talk the potential sponsor away from that because of exactly what would happen. The kind of consequences would be bad. I mean, I know that at different times, like even today's, when I was the editor-in-chief at Scientific American, there were certainly advertisers who would say, "Hey, here's an interesting idea. What about if we do this?" And to be fair, even like our own ad salespeople were smart enough to know to be able to say, "No, we can't be doing that kind of thing. Let's try something else instead." And I mean, I say this with no particular desire to be laughing at the people of science blogs and taking any kind of Schadenfreude at their problem with this. This is a kind of mistake that, quite honestly, anybody can fall into. And the reality is, it is the nature of that sort of the tension that can exist between the supposedly independent editorially and the supposedly non-infringing advertising. There is always a lot of tension in that, and it is the nature of the advertisers to try to push at the envelope of that as much as possible because they don't want to be just another ad.
Right.
So it's tough. It's easy to make a mistake, but that's why you try to point to things like rules that will keep your tires on the road at all times.
Yeah, and I just can't. I keep thinking though. There's got to be some amount of each new generation comes in and wants to try new things, but they're not necessarily new things. They're maybe things that the generation before them tried and they didn't work, but maybe nobody wrote it down or publicized the fact that this is not something that you should be doing. I'm just wondering how much of the information about what you do and what you don't do actually trickles down to people as they come into these into these industries, especially advertising, trying to figure out what to do with digital media. And I mean, I don't know. This is another direction entirely, but it's to take this conversation. But it's an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. It's where some of the kinds of professional associations, like, for example, the American Society for Magazine Editors and the like, to the extent that they represent a kind of independent field memory where they're kind of like examples of like, well, here are certain mistakes we don't want anybody to make again.
Ever.
That kind of thing. Though, I think it is also the case of that there are certain kinds of mistakes that will get pop up because everybody involved sort of forgets these things. There was a notorious example back in, I think it was the late 80s or very, very early 90s with Omni Magazine, where Omni Magazine used a hologram of a Motorola cell phone on the cover of the issue, which was actually, the cover had a little cutout in the middle of it, so that actually, when you would open the cover, you would realize you were looking into an ad for Motorola that was there on the first inside spread. That led to, I believe, their managing editor hanging up her coat right at that point. She wanted nothing more to do with that. I believe that's how that story runs. So, people will do these things, and it all goes down to a question of sort of what ultimately, there's always a question of what you think your audience is going to do or wants to have to do in distinguishing the advertising from the editorial. There are places that certainly say, "Hey, listen, we trust our readers to understand everything, and that's why we're not going to follow any of these rules." And they go their own way.
And they do. I'd like to turn the conversation a bit away from the advertising and that conversation of editorial versus advertising and that relationship there to the actual reporting of the science and the science stories that have been out recently. That we both talked about a few stories that kind of caught our interest and were reported well, but at the same time had problems with them. And I was thinking the story of the longevity genes responsible for centenarians, people living over 100 years. There was a study came out saying, hey, we found these genes. We sequenced and we looked for genes in all these old people, and we found a bunch that were in common, so these must be the longevity genes. And everyone was very excited, and now everybody wants to go to 23andMe and get their DNA sequence to find out whether or not they have those gene markers, right?
Well, that's sort of the natural response to that. Although I think even the researchers behind that were starting to say, well, it's a little premature to try to apply this in quite that way. But they were naturally excited about that. What of course has also happened just in the past couple of days following up on all this excitement has been a new sort of criticism that's come out about that study, which is that it's a little bit technical, but basically the scientists, they looked at the genes of more than 1,000 people who had lived to be 100 years old or older, and also about 1,200 people who had not lived that long, and that's how they had come up to identify these gene markers. It turned out, unfortunately, that they had used two different kinds of DNA chips to do these analyses, one for the centenarians and one for the rest of the population. And all DNA chips are subject to certain kinds of errors, and different kinds of chips make different kinds of errors. So it sort of invalidated the comparison between the experiment and control groups in this case. At this point, everybody is sort of looking at this as sort of a weird failure of the science itself. That the scientists behind this are very well regarded. They're clearly very careful scientists, and most of the science in this paper looks great. What no one can figure out is why it was they didn't in the end find one type of chip and check all of their results against all of that. And it's also unclear how it is that this study, which had what is in retrospect a relatively obvious flaw, why it is that actually got into a first-rate journal like the journal Science.
Yeah.
Everybody sort of feels like, gee, the scientific institutions themselves kind of fell down on the job in this case.
And I love the try and bring up the link here to the Knight Science Journalism Tracker. They do a great job of actually tracking stories in the media. So who is writing what about different stories in the science media. And I love the fact that it was, I think it was Newsweek's Mary Carmichael who actually was the first to write a story about the problems and saying, hey, there were a lot of scientists who were kind of saying this study is not cool. There's something wrong here, and we need to talk about it. And she was one of the first to actually break this story and to actually talk about it publicly. So I'd like to say that it, in some respects, this story is a success story for science journalism actually getting the facts out.
Right, exactly. One of the kinds of things that, if you look at the analogy of what you find in other areas of reporting, you count on your political reporters to in some ways be watchdogs over what the politicians are doing. You count on the business reporters to help to be on watch for things that may be potentially shady goings-on that are going on in the business community. And similarly, in the science reporting field, you would like the science reporters to also be casting a skeptical, well-informed enough eye over the science that's coming through, that they're doing more than kind of just serving as a sort of public relations function of rewriting the original papers and making them understandable to the public. What happened in this case was, it's true. It looks like it was a great job of really thinking this through and raising some good questions that at least in retrospect, it sounds like even the scientists say, we should have caught this ourselves.
Have there been any other stories, do you think, that are either failings lately or successes like this one in terms of what the media has been getting out?
Well, let's see. One thing that's, it's a story that is very thorny and complicated in a lot of ways is the one people talk about, Climategate. This is the story that arises from the fact that last November, more than 1,000 emails and other electronic documents were hacked out of the archives at the Climate Research Center at University of East Anglia in Great Britain, which is a major center for climate research. And as this was then, these emails were hacked out and they were distributed over the internet. And some of the kind of, what do you want to call them, skeptics or deniers, whatever else, they were maintaining that these showed that yes, indeed, there was a vast conspiracy among the climate researchers to try to monkey with the evidence to show that there really was global warming going on, and also that they were clearly biased in doing everything they could to try to stop anybody who was skeptical of that point of view from getting into good journals. So there was a report that just came out this past week. It's one of, I think this is like the 5th different examination that's been made of this whole case. In this case, it is called the Russell study because it was headed up by Muir Russell, who was a vice chancellor at the University of Glasgow, and they looked at everything about this. And once again, they came to the conclusion that there was no evidence of malicious intent in any of this. That notwithstanding some really unfortunate statements that could be found in some of the exchanges between the climate scientists who thought they were having a private conversation, and vented probably in the way that people do have in private conversations. That notwithstanding some of that, there really was nothing to suggest that the rigor and honesty of the science was in any way in doubt. The report did come to the conclusion that there was a kind of consistent pattern that a lot of the scientists had not necessarily always been as open in responding to some of the things like freedom of information requests as they could have been. And that they were sort of keenly aware that a lot of information that they might have in their files, if it came into the possession of some of these kinds of deniers, that it would be used against them in some way. But it seems like there's sort of a siege mentality that developed in some of this. But overall, they were entirely honorable in all of their dealings, and quite frankly, I think it's sort of understandable. It sounds like they were deluged with a lot of requests that they tried in good faith to answer, but they would get the same requests over and over again from people that they knew were trying to knock down what they were doing. The report came out, and this is a perfect case of in some ways the reporters seeing what they wanted to see in this. So you got some stories about this had headlines talking about that the Russell report completely vindicates the scientists at the Climatic Research Unit. And others looking at this saying that the report had rebuked the scientists for failing to be sufficiently open and transparent. It's both in there. I think if you go back and look at the original report, I would say for the most part, it's far more of an exoneration than it is a slap on the wrist. But there are definitely things in there that the researchers do need to try to improve on. But in a highly politicized area like this, it just goes to show that it's almost, they're sort of damned if you do and damned if you don't, and they can be held to what might really be an unreasonable standard of behavior and communication.
And on that, I'm going to take a short break again for our second sponsor for the hour, Audible.com. So if you will please take this moment to thank Audible.com for sponsoring this hour of Dr. Kiki Science Hour. Audible.com is the leading provider of audiobooks, MP3s, podcasts, all sorts of things that you can put on your computer or your mobile devices and take them where you want, listen to them when you want. The whole thing is about choice, right? Audible.com has over 75,000 titles in their library. All sorts of different genres. They've got science, which I love. You all know that. They have fiction, which I also love. I don't know if you know that. And they have biographies, autobiographies. They have periodicals. They have, I mentioned earlier, podcasts, all of them in easily downloadable MP3 formats that you can take with you on the go. Listen to them on the bus. Listen to them in your car, on your bike. Just make sure you don't get hit by a car if you're on your bike. But the thing here is that Audible is going to give you a free audiobook download just for trying out their service. You try out their service, sign up. They have a free, you try it out for a little while, get one free audiobook download just for signing up officially for their service. And you can pick whatever book you want. I have a book that I suggest based on this conversation we're having here. If you are interested, you can take a listen to The Weather Makers. The Weather Makers, How Man is Changing the Climate and What It Means for Life on Earth. This book is by Tim Flannery. He's an Australian scientist. He wrote this book a couple of years ago. I do believe there is a children's version out in print. That's coming out in print this month, actually. But the adult version of the book is a pretty good listen, or a pretty good read. And the regular price is $25. You can get it for free for signing up for Audible service. All you have to do is go to audiblepodcast.com/Kiki and sign up. You can, they have like a 14-day trial where you can try things out and take a look at it, but you don't get to really download full things. Sign up, get your free audiobook download, audiblepodcast.com/Kiki. You can download The Weather Makers or any other book of your choice. I'd like to thank audible.com for sponsoring this hour of Dr. Kiki Science Hour. So, John, I was going to open up the phone lines to see if anybody had any comments or questions. So if you're up for that, we have a few minutes left in the show, and we'll see what we get from the audience if they have commentary on science writing. Sorry, I have to start my call. I'm starting my talk shoe call right now. Oh, is it broken? It's not what I wanted to do. I don't have a username or a password. Twit live. Start. Go. Did I not do it fast enough? Oh, I am completely bummed. I thought I was doing it all right so that I could accept phone calls. It was working just a little while ago. Yeah. Oh, I'm so sad. I don't have the actual login information. That would be Eric's domain. So
I was all set to try to do this as Larry King the whole time. Hello, Piscataway, you're on the air.
You're on the air.
Oregon Fairchild. She's one foxy lady.
Oh, yeah. Normally, it just starts when I hit start, but maybe I waited too long. Yeah, that's not going to work. Okay, never mind. I got you guys all excited. Told you that you could call in, and I lied. So we're just going to continue our conversation. I suggest that you try, commenting in the chat room. I'm going to keep an eye on the chat room to see if you have any interesting questions that we can add to this. I saw one that was a kind of a fun question, doesn't have to do with recent science news, but someone known as Metric 8 was wondering about if either of us had any insight into whether or not science journalists play a role in. See if I can find the exact question. Here we go. The state of the SI/metric system of measurement vis-a-vis the U.S. public. Are scientists frustrated? And should we do something to change the situation of the metric system versus the standard imperial units?
So let me get this straight. Someone named Metric 8 is asking us whether we could do more to push along the metric system.
Yep.
You've asked an excellent question. Yeah, for those of us old enough to remember the brief time back in the 70s when it looked like there was a glimmer of hope that the United States might actually switch around and use the metric system like essentially the entire rest of the planet. Yeah, that, you know what, that is Science journalists probably actually can do a little bit about this, but institutionally, nah, they're not in a position to push this along, because they can certainly do things like use SI units, metric units alongside the different kind of imperial units. But the fact is that you don't want to be confusing and bogging down your readers too much. And as long as those old traditional English units are still there, that's what people are going to pay attention to most of the time. I think, unfortunately, the rise of things like simple cheap calculators and the rest has also done a lot to undermine the what would have been the obvious value of being able to switch to the metric system. It's just still now so easy for people to do the conversions.
Google.
So I don't know.
I just go straight to Google.
What everyone does.
Google convert pounds to kilograms.
Maybe when the robots are running the planet, they can do everything in metric, and they can just tell us what units we have to use. I don't know.
An interesting story that was in the news this week that you brought up that I think is just so much fun. In addition to the longevity genes, there is the fascinating tale of life at high elevation and evolutionary changes for the blood to hold more oxygen. So changes to the hemoglobin.
Yeah, this is a great story, and it's a great example of a kind of science story that, at one level, seems like it should be just such a neat, simple little story, but it actually gets a lot more complicated and it has a lot more things hanging off of it than you would think. So the essence of the story is this. As we all know, if most of us who live somewhere approximately around sea level go up to high elevations, we have a lot of problems with the altitude because there's not enough oxygen in the air. We get altitude sickness and exhaustion and muddy kind of thinking. And people who live at high altitudes, naturally they also are subject to a lot of problems. Our bodies will naturally respond in a lot of those cases to simply put more red blood cells and hemoglobin into our blood as a way so that we're getting, sucking every oxygen molecule we can out of every breathful to help our needy tissues. And indeed, if you look at the populations of people who live in the Andes, they tend on average to actually be expressing more hemoglobin in their blood. But you also see issues there with some sorts of things like higher infant mortality and lower birth weight. There are definitely is a reproductive hit to that sort of thing because your blood is thicker.
Right.
But a funny thing happens if you look at the people who look at the highest elevation on Earth, the Tibetans. The Tibetans who live, 13,000, 14,000 feet up at a point where you only have about 60% of the oxygen at a lower pressure than we have at sea level. They not only seem to do just fine without any problems, but they actually don't have unusually large amounts of hemoglobin in their systems. They somehow have only the normal amount of hemoglobin. And a couple of studies came out in just the past month that were able to attach this to one particular gene variation that seems to be only present in about 10% of the population or less in the sort of the ethnic Chinese population that you would find down near the base of the Himalayas, but that when you look up at the Tibetans themselves, it's present in about 90% of them. So, so there's a really an interesting kind of genetic change that's taken place. But what's interesting is how fast that may have happened. And this is where it gets kind of touchy, because one of these papers, they did sort of genetics population study, and they made an argument that the Tibetans had actually separated from the population of people at the bottom only about 3,000 years ago. This is a very touchy point because, of course, the archaeologists all say that that Tibet has been occupied for at least 7,000 years, probably more like 15,000 years. And the Chinese government itself, which would, for political reasons, like to try to be able to make the point that the people living in Tibet are really actually still kind of Chinese and not separate themselves, they're very happy with this sort of result. The archaeologists, of course, all protest that they couldn't have separated that recently. And in fact, some follow-up criticisms now of the population genetics seem to suggest that no, saying 3,000, that's like the shortest level. 6,000 may be at least as likely. So there's still some controversies about all of that. But
right.
Here's a case where, it starts off as a study about altitude and how our bodies adjust, and it becomes a much more sweeping story about maybe potentially the fastest example of evolution that we've ever seen in human beings.
And beyond that, it potentially has political ramifications if the Chinese don't sweep it under the rug.
Right. Or, of course, maybe it's not the fastest example of evolution, in which case the political ramifications go all the other way, and, that speaks for itself.
John, it's been so fun to have you on the show today. I have really enjoyed talking about all these, just the breadth of topics with you. I'm wondering where people can find you more. What are you doing now, and how can people read your work?
I mean, I'm still a contributor now and again to Scientific American, but people who want to keep tabs on me can certainly come to my own website, which is strangely named johnrennie.net, or you can also follow me on Twitter if you like at TVJRennie. I'm there constantly, my wife says. So
you're not alone.
Yes. So please come on by.
Excellent. And what are you working on? Or are you going to be? I'm wondering if now that you're not as tied to Scientific American, are there any neat projects in line? Are you going into TV? What's happening next?
That would be nice, wouldn't it? Yes, if that's right. I'll probably be holding something out of sight for the Mythbusters. That would actually probably be pretty cool. Yeah, actually, if you watch a lot of like the History Channel and some of those things, or Discover and the like, if I somehow seem to have, for a while there, I was the go-to guy to be talking about the science of the potential apocalypse in 2012.
Oh, awesome!
My role was to constantly try to explain, here's why it's not going to happen, but here are a bunch of kinds of apocalyptic things that theoretically are scientifically valid. So I am very closely associated with the end of the world in a lot of people's eyes, which is really pretty much the role I always wanted to have anyway. So
you got what you wanted. Just out of curiosity, how do you think those shows turned out? Were you happy with the end result and the writing and the dramatization and everything that was?
They are a mixed bag, and it's probably a lot. You could do a whole other episode just about what happens sometimes to when ideas for science shows as they work their way through the sausage factory that is TV or other media. Yeah. I have a lot of respect for the people who are involved in a lot of those things. There are a lot of people standing all around who can sometimes manage to shift things around. So it was a very mixed bag. There were some that worked out great, some not so great a lot.
Right, which is usually the case for anything.
Right.
Things are good, things are bad. Again, thank you so much for joining me. This has been a lot of fun, and I hope that I can get you on the show sometime in the future so we can talk about more cool science stuff and the good and the bad things in the writing, and kind of analyze what's going on in the science writing sphere.
I'll be here all week. Tell your friends. Tip your waitress.
Excellent.
Good night, everybody.
Good night. Good night, Irene. And on that note, I am Dr. Kiki, and this has been the Science Hour. Thank you, everyone, for watching. I do appreciate you taking the time out of your day and learning a little bit. Whatever it is that we happen to talk about here on the show, whether it be neutrinos or science writing. You can find me online. Google Dr. Kiki. I have a webpage, my blog, drkiki.tv. I am Dr. Kiki on Twitter, and there is a Dr. Kiki fan page attached to my page in Facebook somewhere. And you can catch old episodes of this show at twit.tv/Kiki. We're also on YouTube if you want to embed videos on your website. Who'd have thought that possible? You can take the Science Hour and put it on your website if you want to, thanks to YouTube. We are in video, we are in audio, in iTunes. We're all over the place. And tell your friends, because the Science Hour and science worth sharing. Learning about your universe and hearing the conversations that people have to find out more information about it just makes your life, your world, a whole lot more interesting. Thanks a lot.